This class and consideration is one that for me was very encouraging as I was looking into Jordan's place in Bible prophecy and then comparing that to historical events and seeing the work of the angels that of course have been working for centuries and millennia to bring about the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. It says in Romans, after all, that all of creation is groaning for the manifestation, waiting for the manifestation of Christ and the saints. But in this case, we're going to look at a specific example of a detail that is set forward in the Scriptures concerning how God will provide for his people Israel in the day of the Battle of Armageddon. And why it was encouraging for me is because the events that we'll consider in the first portion of our class this evening are events that took place 50 years ago, actually over 50 years ago now. And so when we consider in the lives of our families, in the lives of our ecclesias, that there were those who lived their lives in the truth with full expectation that Christ would return in their lifetime and now lie in the grave waiting the resurrection. This study for me was one that gave me hope that indeed the return of Christ must certainly be close. And although we have those who have fallen asleep awaiting the return of Christ and now await the resurrection of the dead, surely our Lord's return cannot be that far away. Well, let's consider then the context of Jordan's place in future Bible prophecy, and that is the Battle of Armageddon. Because what we're going to see revealed in the Scriptures for us is that God has prepared a place that the children of Israel, the 1/3 that will survive the Battle of Armageddon, can flee during this big battle. We read of that battle in Revelation 16, verse 16. He gathered the kings of the earth into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. And we know the Battle of Armageddon, it speaks of it all over the place. In fact, in a couple of nights, God willing, we'll be considering how the Battle of Armageddon is even taught to us out of what were Sunday school lessons for many of us. But most plainly, the Battle of Armageddon is taught to us in Ezekiel 38, where we have a confederacy of nations aligned with a king called Gog that come down upon the mountains of Israel, and that ultimately it's God who will fight against those armies in that day, the armies that oppose them being in some bewilderment at that time. It's described in the prophecy of Zechariah, the end of chapter 13 and into chapter 14, which we'll go to in a minute, which talks about that great battle that will take place in Jerusalem at that time. Chapter 13 revealing to us that 2/3 of the Jews that are in the land will be cut off in that Battle of Armageddon. It will be a judgment for the Jews that are in the land. It's spoken of in Joel chapter 2 and in Joel chapter 3, the Battle of Armageddon, is it not? Where Joel chapter 2 describes the Babylonian army that came in and over the city walls and would once again, having done it 3 times before, would once again come in and finally destroy the city. But Joel chapter 2 ends with a vision of the destruction of the invading army from the north. So it couldn't possibly have been referring to the Babylonians in Joel's day, but has a second layer that points forward to the Battle of Armageddon, actually a third layer, because the second layer pointed forward to the Romans coming into the city. And in Joel chapter 3, there's a picture of all nations being judged by God in, as it were, a court. And then Revelation 16 speaks plainly of that day and of the spirit that causes the nations to rebel against Christ and to come up against him in the Battle of Armageddon. Well, let's turn then to one of these passages in Zechariah chapter 14, if you will, please. In Zechariah 14, we read of this same day, this Battle of Armageddon. starting at verse 1 and reading down to verse 4. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall Yahweh go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. Whose feet? Well, the one who bears Yahweh's name. It will actually be Christ. And it won't be Christ alone, as we'll see in a couple of nights, God willing, but Christ and all the saints with him. And his feet, the multitudinous Christ, bearing the name of Yahweh, shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley. Half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. And so we're given a picture here, some details about this battle of Armageddon. We know from Ezekiel 38 that nations have become confederate. They've come down into the nation of Israel. In fact, from Daniel, we learn that they passed through first down to Egypt, sweeping all the way down the coast, taking all of those territories, and then specifically come back to fight against Jerusalem. And when that happens, the Lord Jesus Christ will appear. His feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem, and there will be a great earthquake. And that earthquake will produce a valley, half of the Mount of Olives going towards the north and half going toward the south, creating a valley in the midst thereof. And what's the purpose of the valley? Verse 5, and ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. And there's our word on the screen before us. This word Azel means laid aside, reserved, withdrawn, or withheld. Its parent means beside or near. So there's a twofold meaning then to this word Azel. One is that it's been prepared or reserved. It's been withheld from something. And the second meaning is that it's close by. And it's close by because it needs to be a way of escape for the Jews that will survive. Verse 5, ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. And so this valley is created as a way of escape for the Jews that are to be preserved through that trial. Now, some are preserved because they're carried away captive, and then they're gotten and returned by Christ and the saints. But some of them will flee through this newly made valley, and they'll flee to a place called Azel, a place that God had set aside, had reserved, had withheld. Now, it's interesting that when we come over to Daniel chapter 11, back to Daniel chapter 11, we read about that northern confederacy that comes into the land of Israel as well, using different language. In this time, that confederacy is called the King of the North. And at verse 41 of Daniel chapter 11, we read, the King of the North shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. So not just Israel, not just the glorious land, many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. And he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Well, Edom and Ammon and Moab historically are in the modern territory of Jordan. So we're told in Daniel chapter 11 that when the Gogian Confederacy, the king of the north, comes down into the land, that God specifically preserves those territories that were on the east side of Jordan, today occupied by the nation of Jordan, then known as Edom, Ammon, and Moab. And that they were reserved or set aside, protected from the invasion from the north. Well, turn over with me to Isaiah chapter 16, where we pick up the same story. Why was the valley created? It was created as a way of escape for the Jews that would be fleeing from the face of the northern aggressor, the king of the north, the Gogian Confederacy. Well, in Isaiah chapter 16 at verse 4, now this, of course, is in the section of Isaiah where he is giving burdens to different nations, and we're in now the burden of Moab. And at Isaiah 16, verse 4, we read, "Let mine outcasts dwell with thee, Moab. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler, for the extortioner is at an end. The spoiler ceaseth, and the oppressors are consumed out of the land." So God commands Moab. We've just said that the territory of Moab was on the other side of the Jordan River, which is close by, as it were, to Jerusalem. A place that when you create a valley that runs east-west through the Mount of Olives would be more accessible for the Jews with their families as they're fleeing from the face of an oppressor, like we've seen so many times played out for us in recent years with the war in Syria and now the war in Europe. As we see families with their children in suitcases fleeing from their homes from the face of the aggressor as they try to get away from the face of war. This had happened once before, actually. If we were to look at 1 Samuel chapter 22, which we won't do, we would see that David, when he was fleeing from an aggressor, he took his family and he left them in Moab. He took his father and his mother and he left them with the Moabites while he fled from Saul. And so this history had happened once before. And in fact, the history happens yet again, as we'll see in a minute. Well, let's take that then and turn over to Isaiah chapter 16. We're told here that the outcasts of God would dwell with Moab, and that they would be a covert for them, a place of protection to flee from the face of the spoiler. When we go over to Isaiah 21, we're now in the burden of Arabia. Isaiah 21 at verse 13. The burden upon Arabia. In the forest of Arabia shall ye lodge, O ye traveling companies of Dedanim. The inhabitants of the land of Tema brought water to him that was thirsty, and prevented, a better word is there on the screen, met with their bread him that fled. Well, who are these people that have fled into a territory that could be fed by the Arabians? It says that they're those that have fled from the sword, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the grievousness of war. And what we're being given a picture of here, brothers and sisters and friends, is that when the battle of Armageddon comes and the war is waged against Jerusalem, in order for God to preserve a remnant of the children of Israel living in the land called Judah, a valley is created by the earthquake that hits at that time. And the earthquake splits the Mount of Olives, creates a valley, and through that valley will flee the children of Israel. And they'll cross over the Jordan River, and they'll be safe in Jordan. But Jordan has a history of taking refugees. We'll see that in our video, in fact. In 1970, they took the Palestinians when none of the other neighboring Muslim nations wanted them. The Jordanians took them. There's over 1 million refugees living in Jordan today, from Syria, from Iraq, from Iran. They're a place that has always been welcoming of refugees. But in this case, a number of Jews that will be preserved have been taken off into captivity, but at least 1 million will need a place to flee from the face of the aggressor. Well, this would overwhelm Jordan. And so, we're told in Isaiah 21 that the inhabitants of Arabia, that is Saudi Arabia today, Amman and Yemen and Qatar, which, by the way, have recently entered into talks and negotiations with them, at least the fringe nations in the Arabian Peninsula have, they will bring up food and water and supplies to those that fled from the face of the aggressor, from the drawn sword and from the bent bow and from the grievousness of war. And so we have this picture then of the Confederacy, the King of the North, coming against Jerusalem from the north and from the south, having swept down the coast into Egypt, and they come back up when they hear rumors in the land of Israel, which we believe to be Christ and the saints arriving. And when that happens, the earthquake takes place, a valley is created, a place called Azel, a place that God reserved or withheld, that he prepared for, and the children of Israel will flee through that valley into the land of Jordan, where they will also be nourished by those of Arabia. Now again, we mentioned this wasn't the first time that this had happened, that David, when fleeing from Saul, had taken his parents and put them with the Moabites. And in fact, when Babylon came up to Jerusalem, there were also Jews that had fled across the Jordan to Moab. We read of that in Jeremiah 40. Likewise, when all the Jews that were in Moab, and among the Ammonites and in Edom, all in the modern territory of Jordan, and that were in all countries, heard that the king of Babylon had left a remnant of Judah, even all the Jews returned out of all places whither they were driven and came to the land of Judah. So even once before, when the Babylonians had come up against Jerusalem from the north, there had been a remnant that had fled over to Moab and were preserved there. We're now going to look at a documentary, brothers and sisters, that lasts about 8 minutes. And it's interesting to us because we're going to see that the angels were actually preparing for the events of Zechariah chapter 14 over 50 years ago in 1970. In 1970, the events that we'll consider, the foundation was laid for the Jordanians to receive Israel at a time when an aggressor would come up against them. It sounds somewhat absurd, does it not? And yet we're going to see very clearly that events were turned in such a way that it left Jordan still to today owing Israel at a time that they were under threat of destruction from an aggressor that was to them north as well, and that Israel had swooped in to save their day. And so 50 years ago, the angels were working on this minutest little detail in Zechariah chapter 14 to prepare the place that God would allow for the children of Israel to flee from the face of the aggressor. Just to set the stage in this documentary, it's all in first person. When it starts, we're going to hear the king of Jordan talking. He's no longer the king of Jordan, but he was at the time that these events transpired. We're going to hear the Prime Minister of Israel speaking, the United States Secretary of State, President Richard Nixon will be speaking. The captain of tanks, the captain of a fleet of airplanes will speak in first person as they describe the events that we're going to witness in this short snippet of a documentary. Now, the background was the 6-day war. that the Arabs lost in 1967. And after the Arabs lost the Six-Day War, Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians, figured that he would launch his own warfare through the news media against Israel. And the Palestinians have become masters at that for decades now. They've done the same thing, where they will videotape the homes that have been destroyed with children in them that happen to be the places where rockets are being fired out of against Israel. But back then, what they publicized was that the Israeli soldiers were entering into towns and they were defiling the Palestinian women. Well, this completely backfired on Yasser Arafat. The reason he published it was to get international sympathy against Israel. These people are monsters. But what he didn't count on was his own people listening to the news broadcasts. And when his own people heard that the Jewish soldiers were entering into villages and raping the women, they all fled from Israel. And so now there were thousands upon thousands of Palestinians that were looking for new homes. And they went first to Egypt, and the Egyptians said, "No, we're not interested, because we found you to be a rather tumultuous people," even as the Philistines of old in the history of that territory had been. And then they went up to Syria, and the Syrians said, "No, we're not interested in taking Palestinian refugees." And they went to Lebanon, and Lebanese said, "No, we're not interested in taking Palestinian refugees." And they turned to Jordan, and Jordan said, "Okay, we'll take you refugees." 3 years later, just 3 years later, when everyone else had rejected them, when they had fled from their homes because of a lie from their leader, they decided they didn't like their conditions in Jordan, and they rose up against the Jordanians to fight against them. And so as the documentary begins, we'll see the Palestinian rise up against Jordan, and the king is talking in this documentary about a painful decision that he has to make to go to war against his own brothers, his own Muslim brothers. We'll see that the Palestinians will ask the Syrians to defend them, and Jordan will seek U.S. protection from Syrian tanks when the story takes a bit of a twist.
4 days later, with control of the kingdom slipping away, King Hussein declared war on the PLO. That day, Jordanian tanks and soldiers moved into position around the capital. Arab was poised to fight Arab.
I think I tried to get a little sleep that night. I prayed a lot. And in the morning, first light, there was movement into the city.
The early hours of September 17, I woke up when we heard the artillery bombing our bases. So what we did immediately is that we went to Arafat's office, the Joint Command. Arafat was there. Most of the leaders of Fatah were there. Even Harash was there, and they were calling through telephone, through wireless, Damascus, telling them about the news and asking in an open way for a Syrian intervention.
On the third day of fierce fighting, the Syrians responded.
Our intelligence and our radar informed us that the Syrians were massing tank formations on the Jordanian-Syrian border.
We had been arguing over this Syrian invasion, particularly with our Soviet friends at the time. And whenever I raised a problem with the Soviet ambassador, he would respond, "But these are Palestinian army units, and Palestinian army tanks are not Syrian."
And we all knew that the PLO does not have tanks.
But there were tanks, Soviet-built ones, streaming in from Syria.
We were just protecting the Palestinians from the army of Jordan. Our purpose wasn't really to attack the Jordanians. It was a limited intervention on the smallest possible scale. All we wanted to do was support and protect the Palestinian fighters.
In Washington, President Nixon called in his national security advisors to assess the reports from Jordan.
The Soviets were on every platoon leader's tank right up to the border and then jumped off as they crossed the border. And Syrian officers were in command of what were allegedly PLO volunteer forces. So we knew it was an international superpower crisis.
The president summoned the Soviet ambassador.
We warned the Russians and said, stay out of there. They, of course, in turn warned us and said, you stay out and keep Israel out.
In the meantime, King Hussein's forces had destroyed many of the Syrian tanks, but they could not stop the advance. The pressure on the king was increasing by the hour.
When the Syrian tanks had reached the town of Irbil, which is about 2/3 of the way from the Syrian border down to Amman, they're about at that town on the edge of it. That's when he was really starting to panic.
With all the threats from almost every direction, and the situation to all intents and purposes looking almost impossible to cope with. Army headquarters began to tell me that we needed help from outside, and we should ask it from the Americans in any quarter that would be willing to help.
In these circumstances, any quarter could mean only one thing: Israel.
We knew that he had said he would accept help from any quarter, and we thought he'd probably prefer direct American intervention.
He was keenly aware that if he was resurrected and protected as a result of Israeli military intervention, that this would have a strongly negative impact, not only within Jordan itself, but obviously within the entire world.
This was something that was discussed between Cisco, myself, Haig, and one or two of my staff people.
The advisors knew that President Nixon would have to be informed about the situation right away.
I was had to find him. The Secret Service told me he was in the basement of the Executive Office building across the street from the White House, bowling. And that's where I found him.
I remember him coming back into the offices. He said, holy mackerel, the guy's bowling with his black dress shoes on.
He was there bowling alone. And we just started talking. He wanted to have an American intervention.
And of course, we didn't just have an empty cannon there. That's why we moved some fleet units over to that part of the Mediterranean. And that is why we alerted a couple of Marine battalions as well.
I thought it would have been very difficult to manage. We didn't have a commander. We didn't have the right coordination of forces. We didn't know how to end it.
Mr. President, we said, we think the Israelis are in the best position to do this. They're close to the scene. The resources can be employed rapidly.
Once he understood that, he agreed to back the Israelis.
Hussein was quite aware of and approved of what we were doing in this thing, and if he didn't approve, he didn't let us know.
It was America's ambassador in Jordan who broke the news to King Hussein.
And what I was told to say to him is, we'll get the Israelis to come in and help you. And I think this is a very serious moment for the king.
We asked Rabin what the views of the Israeli government would be in these circumstances, and Rabin said he would report home and ask.
I got the authorization to send Phantoms to fly over these tanks. I briefed the leader of the formation myself. I told him, fly over them. Leave no doubt that they see you and hear you. Make mock attacks so that they understand what we want them to do, which is to turn around and go back. So our 4 aircraft perform maneuvers over these tanks. On the side, I had another 2 Quartets waiting, just in case. But no one bothered them. The tanks turned around and went back. A quartet of Phantoms was enough. Defense Minister Assad did not want to commit our Air Force. We were fighting an ally. The Jordanian army is our friend. We can't attack them using planes.
Whether it was because of Arab solidarity or the threat of Nixon's 6th Fleet and Israel's warplanes, Syria finally withdrew.
I love the surmising of what the reason behind the events were as they transpired were of the announcer. We know why it ended up the way it did, don't we? Because the angels made sure that the Americans were not in a position that night to defend the Jordanians. The angels made sure that there was only one nation that could come to the rescue of Jordan 53 years ago, and that was Israel. And these tanks were coming down upon the capital city of Jordan. And the king of Jordan was panicking, and it was Israel that had come to his rescue. And Jordan hasn't returned the favor yet, 53 years later. But they will. God told us they will in Zechariah 14, verse 5, when he said he's going to create a valley in the Mount of Olives, and he's going to prepare a way for the Jewish people to flee from the face of the aggressor over to Jordan, who will receive them because of the events that took place in 1970. 24 years later, Jordan officially signed a peace treaty with Israel. And if you go to the Israeli embassy website, it says that during that 24-year period, they maintained secret contacts and concluded mutually beneficial agreements with Jordan. So from 1970 to 1994, when the official peace agreement was reached, there continued to be discussions between Jordan and Israel. When we were over in Australia visiting with some brothers and sisters, they had the opportunity to tour the land of Israel and ended up being in a cave at a time that a member of the Jordanian royal family came into the cave as well with an entourage of military protection. And they were just there exploring the caves and ended up talking to this couple, Christadelphians, and they were from Jordan, and they explained that actually they were good friends with Israel, and that anything you read in the news about Jordan siding with the Arabs was actually just a show to make sure that they stayed close to their Arab League, but that they always told Israel what they were going to do, even if they involved some of their military in some of those events that were a show of force against Israel. In 2016, Israel and Jordan signed a natural gas contract whereby Israel agreed to supply Jordan with natural gas until 2031. And the ties between Jordan continue. Well, we might be saying, well, this is all fine and dandy, but aren't there some passages in the scripture that tell us that Jordan, or rather Moab and Edom, will be an aggressor against Israel? And isn't there a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 34 that talks about Christ and the saints fighting against Edom? And how do we reconcile these passages that speak about Edom being a friend and Edom being also in opposition? Turn with me to Psalm 83, the reference that's often referred to by those who would believe that the confederacy that comes up against Israel is made up of Arab nations. Psalm 83 says, "Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and have consulted against thy hidden ones. Who are these hidden ones? Those that were spoken of in the prophecy of Zephaniah. Yah hath hid. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And so we have a council, those that have consulted together, those that are confederate, in verse 5 it says, for they have consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against Israel. And then we read on in verse 6, 7, and 8, the tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites, of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, and the Philistines, and the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them. They have holpen the children of Lot. And so we have this list of nations of Psalm 83 that are described as being confederate against Israel. But we have a problem, don't we? Because some of the nations that are listed there are Edom, and Moab, and Ammon, and also the territory of the Hagarenes, and the territory of, the territory of the Ishmaelites, which settled in the area of Arabia. So now, if this is to be understood in terms of a geographical sense, these nations of Psalm 83, we have a conflict with the prophecy that we considered, where Edom, Moab, and Ammon protect the Jews when the northern confederacy comes up against them. Do you see the conflict? Psalm 83 says that Edom, Ammon, and Moab are part of the confederacy that attacks Israel, and yet Isaiah 16 says that Edom and Moab is the place where Israel flees for safety when the confederacy comes against them. It's impossible that Edom and Moab, or modern-day Jordan, can both be part of the aggressor, part of the confederacy that comes up against Israel, part or in alliance with the king of the north, and at the same time be a place that Israel flees for safety, and a place that Israel receives food and water and other supplies from. So how do we reconcile these passages? Well, what we need to understand is that sometimes when God refers to places, he's referring to the characteristics of those places that existed past their nations being present upon the earth. And so this list of people were people that were close to Israel at one time, but ended up being enemies of Israel throughout their history, especially when the Assyrians came up and the Syrians came up against the children of Israel. Many of these nations were hostile towards their what should have been extended family. And so we take a look and see how the character of Edom is described in the Bible. In Ezekiel 35 at verse 5, it describes Edom as being a nation that has a perpetual hatred for Israel. They shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity. So when the Babylonians came up, and previous to that when the Assyrians had come up, the Edomites and the Moabites on the other side of the river had sided with Israel's enemies. In Psalm 137, they're recorded as saying, raise Jerusalem, even to the foundation thereof." This was the spirit of Edom. In Amos chapter 1, historically in the time of Israel, just before the Assyrians come up against them, it says of Edom and of Moab, they pursued his brother with the sword, and they did cast off all pity. And in Obadiah, it speaks of the pride of Edom. So the characteristics of Edom are insatiable anti-Semitism, which is the attitude displayed by Gog, and in Europe, and in many nations even today. And so Edom is actually describing the character of a nation that would be opposed to Israel at that time. We know that Psalm 83 is a symbolic chapter. We won't go into it this evening because we'll come back here on Thursday evening, God willing. But when we carry on in the second half of Psalm 83, God is asked to do unto the confederacy against Israel like he had done to the Midianites under Gideon. And so there's a lot of symbol that's brought out in Psalm 83. Furthermore, when we compare Amos chapter 9 and the language that's used there, which is later quoted in the Jerusalem conference by James, we'll see that the word Edom is understood to represent the nations. Specifically, at that time, and in the context of Psalm 83, nations that were hostile against Israel. Amos 9, verses 11 and 12, speaking of the turning again of the captivity of Israel and the rest